I want to start today by looking at a video clip you sent over. It's grainy, black and white, dated August 9th, 1965. And honestly, it is just uncomfortable to watch.
It really is. It's so raw. I mean, it's one of the most famous pieces of footage in Asian history, but it feels incredibly, almost painfully intimate.
It's deeply uncomfortable because usually when we think of founding fathers, we picture these stoic marble statue figures. We think of Washington crossing the Delaware, or Churchill with the V sign, or de Gaulle standing tall in Paris. But here we have a 41-year-old man, Lee Kuan Yew, sitting in a TV studio, and he is physically collapsing.
He literally chokes up. He can't speak. He has to wave at the producers to, stop the recording. Tears are just streaming down his face.
And usually when a nation gains independence, that's the party, right?
Yeah, that's fireworks, parades, people dancing in the streets.
Exactly. But Lee Kuan Yew called this his moment of anguish.
And that is the twist that defines this entire story. Most countries fight for independence. They bleed for it. Singapore was kicked out.
Kicked out?
Lee Kuan Yew didn't want an independent Singapore. He believed that this tiny island, which had no natural resources, no defense force, and literally had to import its drinking water from the very country that just expelled it, he believed it could not survive on its own.
That is the detail from the sources that just blew my mind. The water.
It's the most basic thing, isn't it?
Right.
It's the hierarchy of needs. You can't build a nation if you're going to die of thirst in 3 weeks.
So he felt he had failed the 2 million people trusting him. He was staring into the abyss.
Absolutely.
And yet, if we fast forward just 30 years from that moment of absolute despair, that failed island had a GDP per capita higher than its former colonizer, Great Britain.
Higher than Great Britain. It's an incredible statistic.
It became one of the safest, wealthiest, and most efficient places on the entire planet.
It is, and I don't think this is an exaggeration, arguably the most dramatic transformation of any society in the 20th century. And it was driven largely by the vision, the will, and let's be honest, the absolute iron fist of that one man.
Today, we are unpacking the life of Lee Kuan Yew. And our mission isn't just to, recite a biography. We want to look at the machinery. We've got a massive stack of sources, memoirs like the Singapore story, archives from the National Library Board, economic analyses, private letters. We really need to answer a complicated question. How did one man's vision turn a malaria-infested colonial outpost into a futuristic metropolis?
And in doing so, was he a savior, a tyrant, or just the ultimate ruthless pragmatist? I think that's the core question.
Exactly.
It's a survival guide for a country that wasn't supposed to exist.
So let's rewind. Before he was the crying prime minister, and long before he was the grand master of Asia, who was he? Because looking at his early life, he doesn't seem like a revolutionary at all.
Not in the slightest. He was born in 1923, and interestingly enough, his family didn't call him Kuan Yew. They called him Harry.
Harry Lee. Just sounds so English.
Exactly. Harry Lee. He was born into a middle-class Chinese family in British-ruled Singapore. But this is the crucial detail. His grandfather was a massive Anglophile. I mean, he essentially worshipped the British Empire. He wanted his grandson to be a perfect English gentleman.
So he was groomed to be part of the colonial elite then?
Very much so. He grew up speaking English at home, not Chinese. He listened to the BBC. He played cricket and golf. And he was brilliant. The sources all highlight that he was competitive from day one. In his senior Cambridge exams, he didn't just pass, he came in first.
First in his class?
No, first in all of Singapore and Malaya, the top student in the entire region.
Wow. So he was the star pupil of the empire.
He was. And he was destined for a comfortable life. He'd go to England, get a law degree, come back, wear a wig in court, and play bridge at the club. That was the path laid out for him.
But then history intervenes, 1942.
The turning point. World War II reaches Asia. The Japanese Imperial Army invades Singapore.
And this wasn't just a military defeat, right? Reading the accounts, this sounds like a total psychological collapse of the British image.
It shattered the world as Harry Lee knew it. You have to remember, the British were seen as invincible. The fortress of Singapore was supposed to be impregnable.
Right, the Gibraltar of the East.
And yet, the Japanese rode bicycles down the peninsula and the British surrendered in days. Lee Kuan Yew watched the British, his supposed protectors, the superior race, being marched off to Chinese prison. He realized in that moment that the British were not superior. They were just people. And they had failed.
No one had the right to push and kick us around. That's a direct quote from his memoir.
Exactly. But the Japanese occupation wasn't just about disillusionment. It was a reign of terror. And there was one specific incident that Lee Kuan Yew survived that likely changed the course of history. It's known as the Sukching Massacre.
This is the story about the truck. I read this 3 times because it just gave me chills.
It should. The Japanese military was rounding up Chinese men who they suspected might be anti-Japanese. It was completely indiscriminate. I mean, if you wore glasses, if you had soft hands, if you looked educated, you were a target.
And Lee Kuan Yew, being a young, educated Chinese man, was ordered to fall in line at a screening center.
He was. And he's waiting there, and he sees men being loaded onto these trucks. And this is where that sharp instinct, that paranoia that served him so well later, kicks in. He sensed something was deeply wrong. It wasn't a logical deduction, it was just a gut feeling.
So what did he do?
He walked up to the Japanese sentry and told him a lie. He said that he had forgotten his clothes and personal items back at the holding area. He asked if he could go back to get them.
And they let him go, just like that.
Miraculously, yes. They just waved him back. Of course, he didn't go back for clothes. He slipped away and ran to the shanty of a rickshaw puller who had worked for his family. He hid there in the dark for days.
And the truck?
The truck he was supposed to be on drove to a beach at Tanamera. Everyone on board was forced to dig their own graves, and then they were machine-gunned into the sea.
My God, he was literally inches away from death.
And that experience, you have to believe, defined his entire political philosophy. He spent the rest of the war working for a Japanese propaganda office called Hubudu, just to survive. He saw how power worked in its rawest form.
It wasn't about laws or gentlemen's agreements.
Not at all. It wasn't about fair play, like the British taught. It was about brutality and fear. He later said, "Power is the vehicle for revolutionary change." He learned that if you cannot protect yourself, if you don't have the gun or the stick, you are nothing.
That obsession with security, that refusal to ever be vulnerable again, it starts right there on that day.
Precisely. That trauma is the key to understanding everything he did later.
So the war ends in 1945. The British return, but the spell is broken. Harry Lee still goes to the UK to study, as was the plan. He goes to Cambridge. And true to form, he doesn't just pass.
No, he destroys the curve. He gets a double-starred first-class honors. For anyone who isn't familiar with the British system, that is exceptionally rare. It's basically academic perfection.
But there's another part of his time in Cambridge that I found really, really humanizing, because often when we talk about LKY, he feels like a machine, like a cold, calculating strategist. But there was a romance.
A very significant one. Her name was Kuan Yew. And she wasn't just a supportive partner, she was his intellectual equal. In fact, back at Raffles College in Singapore, she was the one student who beat him.
Wait, really?
Yeah, she beat him in English and economics.
I love that. He falls for the only person who can actually outsmart him.
It says a lot about him, doesn't it? He didn't want a trophy wife, he wanted a partner. They actually got married secretly in Stratford-upon-Avon in 1947. They were still students, so they kept it quiet from their families. But their relationship was the bedrock of his entire life.
There's a quote from one of his former aides, a guy named Philip Yeo, that really stuck with me. He said, "A teapot has many teacups, but Lee Kuan Yew had only one teacup."
It's a very telling quote, especially for that era where powerful men often had mistresses or, complicated personal lives. Kuan Yew was his confidant, his editor, his fiercest critic.
So she was in the room where it happened, so to speak.
She helped draft the fiery speeches and the legal documents that founded the nation. She smoothed out his rough edges. She was the one person who could look him in the eye and tell him he was wrong.
So he returns to Singapore in 1950, a qualified lawyer with his one teacup by his side. And he gets into politics. But this is where the story gets murky and really interesting. Because we think of him as this anti-communist crusader, right? But in the beginning, that wasn't the case at all.
No, this is the part of the story that often gets skipped over. When Lee Kuan Yew came back, he wanted the British out. But he was just an English-speaking, golf-playing Cambridge lawyer. He had no street cred.
He couldn't connect with the masses?
Not at all. The masses, the rickshaw pullers, the port workers, the Chinese-speaking majority, they were listening to the communists. They were organized, they were disciplined, and they had the numbers.
So he needed them.
He needed their numbers. And they needed him because he was respectable. The British weren't going to negotiate with a communist revolutionary, but they would sit down with a Cambridge lawyer in a suit. So Harry Lee made a deal with the devil.
He called it riding the tiger.
Exactly. The metaphor is perfect. The tiger is powerful, it gets you where you want to go fast, but the moment you get off or if you lose your grip,
It eats you.
it eats you. He formed an alliance with a very charismatic communist leader named Lim Chin Siong, and a mysterious figure known as the Plen, the plenipotentiary, who was the head of the communist underground.
And they formed a political party together.
Will form the People's Action Party, the PAP, together in Lee's basement at Oxley Road in 1954.
Wait, so the party that has ruled Singapore for over 60 years started as a coalition with communists.
It did. And it was a brutal game of 4D chess from day one. Lee knew the communists wanted to use him as a frontman and then discard him. The communists knew Lee wanted to use their votes to get power and then destroy them. They were shaking hands while holding daggers behind their backs.
So who won?
Well, Lee Kuan Yew became prime minister in 1959. And once he had the levers of state power, the police, the intelligence services, he didn't hesitate.
This brings us to Operation Cold Store.
1963. The merger with Malaysia was coming up. Lee Kuan Yew used the Internal Security Act, a law, ironically, left behind by the British, to launch a massive sweep. In one night, over 100 key left-wing leaders, trade unionists, and politicians, his former allies, were arrested and detained without trial.
He locked up the people who put him in power.
He decapitated the movement. He claimed it was necessary for national security to prevent a communist takeover. And given the Cold War context, that was a real fear. But it was also the moment Harry Lee, the lawyer, truly became Lee Kuan Yew, the strongman.
So he secures his power. He pushes for the merger with Malaysia because, as we said, he thinks Singapore can't survive alone. But the marriage is a complete disaster.
It was an ideological divorce waiting to happen. The central government in Kuala Lumpur was built on the idea of Malay supremacy, special rights and privileges for the indigenous Malay population.
And Lee Kuan Yew campaigned for a Malaysian Malaysia.
Which meant a meritocracy, where everyone was equal regardless of race. Which sounds great to us now, but back then that was a direct threat to the ruling party in Malaysia.
It was explosive.
Completely. There were race riots in Singapore in 1964. People were killing each other in the streets. Lee saw the fabric of society tearing apart. And the Malaysian Prime Minister, Tunku Abdul Rahman, eventually decided that Lee Kuan Yew and Singapore were just too much trouble. They were cancer that needed to be cut out.
And that brings us right back to the tears. August 9, 1965. He is kicked out. He is alone. The water might get cut off. The neighbors are hostile. He has nothing.
And this is where the deep dive really begins. Because most leaders in that situation would have failed. The country should have collapsed into a failed state. There was no playbook for a tiny city-state with no resources in the middle of a hostile region.
So let's look at the mechanics. How do you go from doomed to economic miracle? Because looking at the sources, what he did next seems completely counterintuitive for a post-colonial leader in the 1960s.
It was incredibly bold, and it went against all the prevailing wisdom of the time. Most newly independent nations in the 60s were in a mood of intense nationalism.
Right, they were nationalizing industries, kicking out Western companies, trying to be self-sufficient. Yankee, go home.
And Lee Kuan Yew did the exact opposite. He realized Singapore had no domestic market. It was too small. So he had to leapfrog the region. He had to connect directly to the developed America, Europe, Japan.
So essentially, he put up a giant neon sign saying, Yankee, come here.
Come here, bring your factories, bring your technology, bring your capital. He courted multinational corporations, MNCs, aggressively. He sent his best people, like Goh Keng Swee, to the U.S. to knock on doors. Texas Instruments, Hewlett-Packard, General Electric.
But why would they come to Singapore? I mean, at that point, it's a swamp in Southeast Asia with a history of riots and communist agitation.
That's the key question. He had to manufacture stability. He offered them tax holidays, sure. But more importantly, he offered a predictable rule of law, an English-speaking workforce, and absolute labor discipline. No strikes.
And this leads us to the infrastructure. Changi Airport. That feels like a perfect example of his thinking.
The Changi gamble. It's a huge one. In the mid-70s, all the experts said, just expand the old airport at Paya Lebar. It was cheaper, it was safer, it was the sensible thing to do.
But sensible wasn't what he was aiming for.
Not at all. Lee Kuan Yew looked at the map and said, no. If we want to be a global hub, we need room to grow for the next 50 years. He decided to move the entire airport to Changi, on the eastern tip of the island.
Which meant reclassing massive amounts of land from the sea.
A monumental engineering project. It was incredibly expensive. If it failed, it could have bankrupted the state. But he pushed it through. And today, Changi is consistently voted the best airport in the world. It's the spine of their economy.
But you can't have a first world economy with third world living conditions. And this is where I want to drill down, because the housing policy in Singapore, the HDB, is famous, but I feel like people miss the how. the genius of the financing.
Right, the Housing Development Board. And you're right, every politician promises affordable housing. But usually you get these grim projects that turn into slums. Singapore did something completely different.
And the secret sauce wasn't just bricks and mortar, it was a financial algorithm called the CPF.
The Central Provident Fund,
I
yes.
saw that acronym in the notes. Break it down for me. It sounds like a pension plan.
It started as a pension plan under the British. You put money in, your employer puts money in, you save for retirement. Simple. But Lee Kuan Yew weaponized it. He changed the rules to allow people to withdraw their retirement savings early, but only for one specific thing:
Buying an apartment.
buying a government-built HDB apartment. This changed the game completely. Suddenly, a taxi driver or a hawker who has zero cash in the bank has this forced savings account that he can use for a down payment.
Ah, I see what he did. That is so clever. He forced the population to save money, then allowed them to funnel that money back to the government to pay for the housing the government was building.
Exactly. It's a closed financial loop. The government takes your money as savings, uses that capital to build the housing, and then sells the housing back to you using the savings you were forced to put aside. It funded the entire construction boom without Singapore having to borrow massive amounts from the World Bank.
That is genius, but there's a psychological layer too, isn't there? Because earlier you mentioned nation building.
This is the critical insight. LKY observed that people who rent don't care about the property. They riot, they burn things down, they have no skin in the game. But homeowners watch the windows. Homeowners worry about property values.
If you own the flat, you don't burn down the neighborhood.
He literally said, I needed to give every man a stake in the country. If Singapore falls, your property value goes to zero. Suddenly, every single citizen is a shareholder in Singapore Inc.
And he used this for racial integration too, didn't he? It wasn't just about ownership.
He did. This is another piece of social engineering. He imposed strict quotas. Every single apartment block had to reflect the national racial makeup. You couldn't have a Malay block or a Chinese block. You had to live next to someone of a different race.
Forced integration.
It was social engineering through architecture. And it worked. It prevented the kind of ethnic ghettos that caused so many problems in other cities around the world.
But keeping this whole machine running required discipline. And there's a famous anecdote about the Singapore Airlines strike in 1980 that really shows the iron side of Lee Kuan Yew.
Oh, this is legendary. The pilots of Singapore Airlines, the flag carrier, the symbol of a nation's success, were threatening to strike for better conditions. This could have crippled the country's reputation with those MNCs we were just talking about.
And Lee Kuan Yew didn't negotiate in the traditional sense.
No. He went on television. He didn't use a teleprompter. He looked right into the camera, addressing the pilots and the nation.
I have the quote here. He said, I can tell you that when I met the SIA pilots, I didn't meet them with a smile. It took them 65 minutes to realize that this wasn't a game of cards.
He told them bluntly, get back to work. If you don't, I will ground the entire airline. I will fire every single one of you. I will wipe the slate clean and rebuild the airline from scratch. And then he said, I have the gumption to do it.
Wipe the slate clean. He was willing to burn down his own flagship company just to prove a point about discipline.
And the strike ended immediately. They were back at work within the hour. That was the thing about LKY. People knew he wasn't bluffing. When he made a threat, he meant it.
This transitions us perfectly into the next section, because he didn't just manage the economy, he managed the culture. He viewed the population as a project to be optimized. You called him a gardener, constantly pruning the society.
He absolutely viewed the state as a project that needed constant tending. He didn't believe that people would naturally do the right thing. They needed to be nudged or sometimes shoved in the right direction.
And some of these nudges are famous, almost infamous. The ban on chewing gum,
which the West always mocked him for. They called Singapore a Disneyland with the death penalty. But his logic was purely pragmatic. Vandals were sticking gum on the train door sensors, causing delays on the new, expensive subway system.
So the gum disrupts efficiency.
Therefore, ban the gum. It's Spock-like logic.
What about the long hair ban in the 70s?
Same thing. He associated long hair on men with hippie culture, drug use, and laziness. Singapore needed to be rugged and disciplined, not full of dropouts. So the government would actually serve you last at the post office if you had long hair. They'd tell you to go get a haircut before they'd process your paperwork.
That is the definition of a nanny state. But there were bigger, more controversial policies, like the language policy. That must have been incredibly painful for people.
It was. He forced the entire nation to adopt English as the working language. He shut down the Chinese medium universities like Nanyang University. He knew that to trade with the world, to plug into that global economy, Singaporeans had to speak the world's language.
But he also insisted on the mother tongue, right? It wasn't just about English.
Yes, and this is key to his thinking. He was terrified of deculturalization. He didn't want Singaporeans to become pseudo-Westerners, as he called them. So you had to learn your ethnic language, Mandarin, Malay, or Tamil, to keep your values, your cultural ballast.
Okay, we've talked about gum and hair, but looking through these archives, there is some really dark stuff in the 1980s that feels like it's out of Brave New World. We need to talk about the graduate mother scheme.
Ah, yes. This is the moment where the pragmatism veered into something very, very uncomfortable.
I'm looking at a policy where he basically tried to engineer the genetics of the population. Tell me I'm reading this wrong. Did he really try to pay uneducated women to stop having kids?
You are not reading it wrong. This is, without a doubt, the most controversial thing he ever tried. To understand it, you have to understand LKY's worldview. He was a pure elitist. He did not believe all men were created equal. He believed intelligence was highly heritable, that it was in the genes.
That is a very dangerous road to go down.
He looked at the census data in the early 80s and saw a trend that horrified him. Highly educated women were focusing on careers and having fewer babies, while uneducated women were having large families. To him, this wasn't a social choice. It was a crisis of the national gene pool. He thought Singapore was literally getting stupider with each generation.
So he intervened.
Aggressively. He offered tax breaks and priority school admission to the children of mothers with university degrees. Conversely, he offered cash payouts, about $10,000, which was a lot of money back then, to uneducated women if they agreed to get sterilized after their second child.
That is shocking. I mean, that is straight up state-sponsored eugenics. How did the public react? Because usually Singaporeans followed his lead.
This was the one time they balked. It caused a massive uproar. Even his own cabinet ministers were deeply uncomfortable. The voters hated it. It cost the PAP a significant number of votes in the 1984 election.
Did he back down?
Eventually, yes. They quietly rolled it back. But he never changed his mind privately. Until his dying day, in his memoirs, he maintained that a nation's success was purely a numbers game of talent and IQ. He treated the population like a garden. You water the prize roses and you get well.
You prune the weeds. That is a chilling side of pragmatism that we can't ignore. It's not just about efficiency, it's about a total lack of sentimentality regarding what we would call basic human rights.
And that leads us directly to the political repression. Because while he was engineering the gene pool, he was also engineering the political landscape to ensure no one could challenge him.
We mentioned Operation Cold Store earlier, but he didn't stop there.
No. He had very little patience for Western-style liberal democracy. He believed it led to gridlock and chaos. He looked at the Philippines or India and saw paralysis. He wanted a system that worked, that delivered results.
And he used the courts as a weapon, didn't he? Defamation lawsuits.
He did. His argument was that if someone defamed him or his government, he had to clear his name to maintain public trust. So he sued political opponents for defamation. He sued foreign newspapers like the Wall Street Journal and The Economist. And he always won. He won millions in damages.
And the result was that opponents, like a politician named J.B. Jeratnam, were sued into bankruptcy. And if you are bankrupt in Singapore, you can't run for office.
Whatever works. It was legal, but it was absolutely ruthless. He destroyed the opposition not with death squads or gulags, but with lawsuits and regulations.
There is a Machiavellian quote that LKY cited himself. Between being loved and being feared, I've always believed Machiavelli was right. If nobody's afraid of me, I'm meaningless.
He stood by that. He explicitly rejected the idea that he needed to be loved. He wanted to be effective. And he would ask the listener, and us, to look at the trade-off. You give up some civil liberties, you don't have a freewheeling press, you can't protest without a permit, but in exchange, you get safe streets, good schools, high wages, and total political stability.
It's the ultimate utilitarian argument. And for the generation that lived through the riots and the war, that trade-off was worth it.
Absolutely. For them, LKY was the man who put a roof over their heads and food on the table. Nothing else mattered as much.
So let's move to the twilight years. Because unlike so many other strongmen, Mugabe, Suharto, he actually stepped down voluntarily.
He did. He resigned as prime minister in 1990. He was the longest-serving PM in the world at the time. But he didn't disappear. He stayed on as senior minister and then later created a new title for himself, Minister Mentor.
Minister mentor. That's a title you don't see often.
It was unique. He was guiding the next generation, first Go Chokdong, and then his own son, Li Xianlong. But in this period, he also became this global sage, the grand master of Asian geopolitics.
World leaders sought him out. I mean, everyone from Nixon to Obama.
He was the China whisperer. He had met every single Chinese leader from Mao Zedong to Xi Jinping. He predicted China's rise long before it was obvious to anyone in the West.
There's that story about Deng Xiaoping's visit in 1978.
A pivotal moment. Deng was a die-hard communist, but he visited Singapore. He looked at the society run by ethnic Chinese that was clean, prosperous, and orderly, and he was absolutely shocked. He saw the future.
And the sources say that Singapore became the model for China's economic opening.
Exactly. Deng went back to China and essentially said, we need to do what they did, but on a massive scale.
Yeah.
So in a way, Lee Kuan Yew's influence extends to the billions of people whose lives were changed by China's economic miracle.
But as he got older, the Iron Man image began to crack. Not politically, but personally.
This is the most poignant part of the story. In 2008, his wife, Chuy's one teacup, suffered a massive stroke. She was bedridden, she couldn't speak, she was locked in.
And this man who was feared by his ministers, who crushed strikes, who engineered an entire society, what did he do?
He adjusted his entire schedule. Every single evening, he would sit by her bedside for hours. He would just read to her.
What did he read?
Her favorite poems, Shakespeare, Jane Austen. He read to her purely for the sound of his voice, to comfort her even though she couldn't respond. He did this every night for 2 years until she passed away.
That is incredibly human. It's a side you just don't see in the political histories.
When she died in 2010, he was visibly diminished. At her funeral, he looked frail and lost. He said, I have 63 years of memories. Without her, it would be a different life.
Lee Kuan Yew passed away in 2015 at the age of 91.
And the reaction was massive. A week of national mourning. Hundreds of thousands of people stood in the torrential rain-typical Singapore weather for hours just to watch his cortege pass by. They were shouting his name. It was a moment of national unity that ironically proved he had succeeded. He had built a nation that felt a collective sense of loss for its founder.
So let's bring this all back to our mission. We've looked at the crying patriot, the ruthless pragmatist, the gardener, the husband. Was he a savior or a tyrant?
I think the label pragmatist fits best, but an extreme, almost terrifying version of it. He was, in the end, the CEO of Singapore Inc.
That's the perfect analogy. He ran the country like a corporation.
Efficient, disciplined, meritocratic. But like a corporation, there is very little tolerance for dissent from the shareholders. If you didn't like the management style, the door was open, you could leave. But if you stayed, you followed the rules.
And he proved that a small island with absolutely nothing, no resources, no defense, could survive through sheer force of will and intellect.
But he left a haunting question. He was always worried about complacency. He feared that the younger generation, the ones who grew up with air conditioning and iPads, who never saw the Japanese trucks or the race riots, would take it all for granted.
He famously asked, "Can this continue without me?"
And that is the challenge for Singapore now. Can the system he built survive the man who built it? Can a system designed for crisis survive in an era of peace and prosperity?
It really forces you to ask what we value most in a society. Is it absolute freedom, or is it order and prosperity? Lee Kuan Yew made his choice, and the results are undeniable. But whether that choice is right for the future, well, that's the open question.
Indeed. It's the legacy of the Iron Man.
That is something for you to mull over. If you enjoyed dissecting the life of this Asian giant and want to understand more about the figures who built our modern world, make sure you are subscribed to History Titans. We have more profiles coming up on the leaders who shaped the 20th century, so hit that follow button and don't miss out. Thanks for listening.
Goodbye.